My name is Ted Gary. I'm your presenter for the next 45 minutes, and I work for Tenable. I was just having a conversation here, and the gentleman said, well, I'm not familiar with Tenable. What do you do? And I said, well, we're mostly known for vulnerability scanners, and asked him if he knew about Nessus. And he says, yeah. So if you've heard of Nessus and you wonder who Tenable is, we're the company that has been making Nessus for a long, long time. For the next 45 minutes, we're going to talk about the key to prioritize risk reduction and cyber excellence. And that is a very presumptuous title. You know, it's like there's one key and we're going to cover it in 45 minutes. You're going to go out of here, just, you know, your life will be changed. It's not going to happen that way. But the key, I'll tell you what it is right up front, in my opinion, and it's in the title, and it's prioritization. And there are a couple of ways that we'll talk about that prioritization is very useful for you. And one is prioritizing your systems according to the impact of a breach should it occur. Because you want to put the strongest controls around the systems that would have the highest impact of a breach to you. And the other area that we're going to talk even more about in terms of prioritization is the controls that you implement and which ones should you implement first? Which ones will give you the most bang for the buck from a security point of view? So that's what we're going to talk about, kind of make several other stops along the way. By way of introduction, I wanted to mention what I call the cyber exposure crunch, because I look at the state of security and I see, you know, there are a couple of things that are really interesting. One is, according to ISACA, the CIS Audit and Control Association, if you're familiar with them, by 2019, there'll be a global shortage of 2 million cybersecurity professionals. Pardon? Oh, it flopped around. I'm sorry. It's a different, I should have caught that. This is not my computer, and you know how sometimes things get scrunched. So I caught it in one place and fixed it, but I didn't catch that. It is 2 million, by the way. And even if that's off by a factor of 2 or more than 2, 1 million is pretty significant. The impact of that is kind of obvious in that you don't have enough people, but it's not just the shortage of people. There's also a related skills gap where I've talked to a number of organizations that they might have, let's just arbitrarily say 10 things that they want a cybersecurity professional to have, 10 qualifications. They can't get to people with those 10 qualifications, so they end up living with 6 or 7 maybe and doing some training with people. So that shortage is really important because it impacts our ability to deliver strong cybersecurity. And then about 9 months ago, Tenable and the Center for Internet Security sponsored some surveys. So we hired a research organization to go out and ask a bunch of questions about what I'll explain in a few minutes, called the Foundational Cyber Hygiene Controls. And we asked 300 plus people how they've implemented them. We asked them specifically, have you automated these controls? Because we felt that was the most important test if they really put these controls in place. And we found that on average, only 50% of the organizations had automated those controls. And these are basic controls. The CIS, Center for Internet Security, says everybody needs to be doing these things. So the fact that only half of the organizations have done them is pretty concerning to me, at least. And then the last one, this is from the National Association of Corporate Directors. So this is for public companies. I know most of you are public sector, but they surveyed their membership and they found out that only about 1 in 5 organizations, 19%, the boards had a high level of confidence in the organization's cybersecurity. And that's pretty sobering too. That means 4 out of 5 organizations, the board didn't feel like they had their arms wrapped around cybersecurity pretty well. I don't know how it is in the public sector, but I don't have any reason to think it's going to be a whole lot different than this. He thinks it might be a little high. Yeah, all right, well, good. But, you know, if this is the backdrop, then prioritization is really important because we don't have enough people. And we've got to do those things that are the most critical things and that will return the most bang for the buck. So the agenda today, I'm going to talk a little bit about a security framework adoption. I personally am a big advocate of security frameworks. We'll talk about why in a little bit. And then I'll go into some more detail about these foundational controls that the CIS designates as the Cyber Hygiene Foundational Controls. I want to talk about automation a little bit, and then how you can build on this foundation, and then a few thoughts about financial justification. How do you, if you're a security professional, try to get the funding that you really need to be successful? So in terms of framework adoption, there are a number of motivators for organizations to adopt a framework, and I didn't put them all up here. For example, I didn't put cyber insurance, and if you've proven that you're using a solid framework and adhering to that, you can get a better rate on cyber insurance. The number one thing I think is regulatory requirements. There are external drivers, whether it be PCI or something else, says you've got to adopt this framework. And so those are very effective. But there's another concept called due care and due diligence that I wanted to mention a little bit. And that's a legal concept that says, I'll kind of put it into terms of security. It says, what would a reasonable organization do to safeguard this data that we have? So it's a reasonableness kind of test. And if you don't do what is reasonable and you suffer a breach, then you can be legally liable for it. And I know it's been over a year ago now, but there was a hotel chain, which I won't name, that had a breach, and the Federal Trade Commission investigated them and said, you did not adhere to this standard of due care and due diligence, and they sued them. And I don't know how much money they got to actually settle out of court, but they won. The FTC won and was able to sue these people. So you've got this as a legal standard, kind of a minimum legal standard that you have to meet. Another reason that it's important is identifying gaps that will require additional investment, and that goes to oftentimes, CISOs will go to their executive management and say, we need this new capability, whether it's, fill in the blank, next generation firewall, the latest endpoint threat detection, whatever it happens to be. And they go in and they tell the executives, we really need to have this. And the executives get tired of it because it doesn't end. 6 months later, they're back asking for something else. And we'll show you near the end of this, one organization that I've worked with, is the city of Portland, Oregon, which is where I'm from, actually. They put together a spreadsheet, and they kind of mapped out, using a security framework, this is where we're strong, this is where we're weak, and they put together a 3 to 5 year plan to remediate, or I shouldn't use that word maybe here, but to fix the areas where they were weak. Another thing is foundation for multiple compliance requirements. If you use a security framework, then oftentimes the controls you put in place with a little bit of tweaking or adjustment can meet PCI requirements or other requirements that you might have. So that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of motivation. It's just there are lots of reasons for the adoption of security frameworks. And this survey that I mentioned that we did with the Center for Internet Security asked a couple of questions about, are you using a framework? And I almost should have put use in quotes here, because when we dug into it a little bit more, some people, on the real low end, it was kind of, yeah, we read it and it influences our thinking a little bit. There are other people on the other end of the spectrum that are very sophisticated in how they've adopted it. But we see a lot of PCI, that was number one. And let me ask, how many of you have PCI requirements in your organization? You have to meet PCI? No, just one or two, okay. And then ISO 27001, 27002, International Standards Organization, that's an international standard, and we had international representation in the survey. That's part of the reason that came in number 2. And then there were the CIS Critical Security Controls. Those you may have heard of. They've been around for a long time. They were called the SANS Top 20 for a long time. Now, then there was some other group that kind of maintained them, and then it went to CIS several years ago. They were called the CIS Critical Security Controls. Today they're called the CIS Controls. They've abbreviated that. But we see about 1 in 5 organizations using that. And then there's also the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which is getting very popular. And so if an organization is using a framework, on average, they're using about 1.5 frameworks, but still we saw about 20% of the organizations that are not using a framework at all. And that's really concerning to me, because they're kind of rolling their own security at that point, and it can be very much hit and miss. So I have some information here about California businesses, and I know probably almost everyone in the room is public sector. And I put businesses in italics here because I tried to do some research and find out would an agency or some other government entity be considered a business underneath this. And to tell you the truth, I don't know. I read it, and there's kind of this other category I'm not sure about, but I thought it was, excuse me, interesting, that the California Civil Code says businesses have to use reasonable security procedures and practices in order to protect information on California residents, basically. So that it goes back to this reasonable security procedures and practices. That's related to the due care, due diligence that we just talked about. In fact, then they define it in February 27, there was a report they put out, the data breach report, and they defined reasonable security procedures and practices in a series of recommendations. And the first recommendation is the 20 controls in the Center for Internet Security's critical security controls define a minimum level of information security that all organizations that collect or maintain personal information should meet. The failure to implement all of the controls that apply to an organization's environment constitutes a lack of reasonable security. So this goes back to some of these motivators for implementing a security framework. And as I said, I'm not sure that this applies in the public sector, but it certainly applies to businesses inside and outside of California that have PII belonging to California residents. And then California agencies, departments, and offices. I was told that these organizations have to comply with NIST Special Publication 800-53. And I got this information from the State Administrative Manual. And I don't know if you're familiar. How many of you are familiar with 800-53? A few of you. And do you have to comply with it? Some do, some don't. Well, if you do, you have my sympathies. That is a big requirement to comply with. It's like, I think the document itself is getting close to 500 pages now, and then when you read it, you find out there are all sorts of little references to other things that you need to go read about, like FIPS 199, which talks about how you categorize information systems into high, moderate, low, and then you can get into a risk management framework, and it's quite challenging. And it was actually developed by the federal government for federal information systems. And organizations like the state of California are now saying, we're not going to go develop our own. We are going to require our organizations to use that. So it's very challenging. And one thing I should mention is that implementing a security framework is oftentimes a multi-year process. There's no easy button. If you don't have some good things in place to start with, it's just not going to be an easy thing. And that goes back to the title of the presentation around the prioritization. How do we get started with that? But before I talk about that, I just wanted to mention one thing. I mentioned just a minute ago FIPS 199 and so on, but down at the bottom of this slide, I've listed the NIST Special Publication 800-171. Do any of you know if you have to comply with that or not? So that's a standard that's for protecting what's called controlled unclassified information. So it's not public, it's federal information, first off, and if it was classified, that would be like secret or top secret, and if it was public, who would care? So the controlled unclassified information is pretty much everything between public and secret information. And they are making they being the federal government, are making organizations that have access to their data, the government's data, federal data, comply with 800-171. And they specifically call out universities and other cities that may have to comply with it. I was talking to someone earlier today who was saying that they're a city, he works for a city government, and they have a tax. I'm not in the city of Portland, even though I say I'm from Portland, so I don't know exactly what the tax is, but it's unless you fall below a certain income level, you have to pay this $35 tax per year. So the city of Portland gets data from the IRS so they can find out if this person who says, no, I don't meet the threshold, if they only make $10,000 a year, if their IRS shows they make $50,000 a year, then they go after them basically and say you need to pay the tax. So they're getting this controlled unclassified information from the federal government. And right now, they don't have a contractual requirement to comply with 800-171, but it's very likely they will in the future. And that's one of the key points about 800-171. The standard's been out for a couple of years. The defense side of the federal government is ahead of the civilian side in applying it. So it's really showing up in all sorts of contracts, and I think by the end of this year, if you're a defense contractor, you and your subcontractors have to comply with this. On the civilian side, they're not quite so rigorous in how they apply it, but if your organization is using federal government, tax government, maybe you're a university and you're doing research with weather data or water table data that you get from the federal government, you could go to the NARA, the National Administration Records and Administration website. They have what's called a CUI registry, and you could find out if you've got data that they would consider to be this protected information, and then you need to start thinking about 800-171. So all of these potential compliance requirements you have, whether it's 800-53 or 800-171, you name it, what I want to do is really talk about how do you get started with that. Given that it's a multi-year commitment and project to do that, you can't just go out and do it all at once. So the Center for Internet Security has developed these foundational controls, and I want to talk a little bit about kind of the process of getting there, some of the steps that you need to think about, and then we'll talk about those controls in some detail. This is just kind of a diagram I put together. It's not super rigorous. If I did it differently, I'd probably have more overlap between the circles and fuzzy edges because it's not quite as precise as I show it here. But you've got to start with your business objectives. What are we trying to do as an organization? Many of you, if you work for a city or a university or whatever, you're going to have some sort of payment you take. And that means you've got to be able to process financial information, maybe credit cards or whatever. And if that's part of your business model, then you've got to look at it and assess the risk around that and say, well, how do we want to deal with this? Do we want to outsource it or transfer the risk? Do we want to deal with it ourselves? And if so, do we need to do some things to mitigate the risk, to get that risk level down to where we're comfortable with? And then another part of the risk assessment, I already alluded to it, is categorize your information systems. So again, it's what is the impact of a breach? If it's a high impact, then you're going to need to have stronger controls in place, a moderate impact, less controls, and then a low impact. And if you want to get some guidance on that, you can look at the FIPS, was it 199? I forgot the exact reference there, but it's the -199 one I referred to. Or there's also a risk management framework that can help you there. But you do that risk assessment, and then you have to develop policies. Now, I mentioned that Tenable does vulnerability scanning, and we do that a long time. And so I've looked at some of these frameworks, and I've said, to see what they say about vulnerability scanning. The NIST Cybersecurity framework, for example, says scans must be conducted. Well, that doesn't tell you very much at all. You know, how often do they need to be conducted? What type of scan do you run? On what systems? Is it on operating systems, applications, network devices? All of that stuff. So you've got to, in most of these situations, go in and develop your own policies, procedures, steps that say, this is how we're going to do it. So you may, for example, if you've got those high impact systems I talked about, you may say, well, for a critical and high vulnerability, well, we're going to scan those, let's say, every week for vulnerabilities. And let me tell you, most people don't scan every week. The average when we talk to customers is monthly, but in some cases it's quarterly, in some cases it's not even that frequently. But you could have a policy that says we're going to scan once a week, and we're going to remediate the critical and high vulnerabilities within, let's just say, 15 days. And so you need to put all of these policies and procedures down on paper, because when you get to the end over there on the far right, the auditors are going to want to see that. They're going to want to say, what are you really doing, or what do you say you're doing, and are you doing that? And then there are the automated controls, and we're going to talk more about that in just a couple minutes. So this is just kind of a background. Let's look at the CIS 20 controls. How many of you are familiar with them? Good. Many people are. So as I mentioned, the top 5 are the foundational cyber hygiene controls. And the first one is to develop, before I get into this, I should say, we have 20 here, But each one of these has subcontrols, and I'm not going to go into the subcontrols, but these first 5, I think they have between 5 and 9 subcontrols that you need to get into that level of detail on. But the first one is an inventory of authorized and unauthorized devices. And if you look at the subcontrols, I'll simplify it and say it says you've got to detect things that are on your network. You have to know everything that's on your network. Then you have to have some means to determine if that is authorized or not. If not, the third thing is you got to get it off the network. Either keep it from connecting or boot it off of the network. So that's what you get into with those subcontrols. If you think about that, if you only had authorized devices on your network, your life's going to be a lot simpler, because if you know about the device, chances are you're managing it, and you've got some systems in place to manage that and make sure it's meeting some minimum security requirements. I talked to a customer that I will not name, but he told me they thought, and it was a city, and he said, we think we have about 5,000 devices on our network. So we don't know about everything. Let's say we have 10,000. And then they put some technology in place to find out what they really had on their network, and they had 15,000 devices. So there are all sorts of things, and he said it's, printers they didn't know about, smart TVs in conference rooms, all sorts of things that they didn't know about. So this inventory of authorized and unauthorized devices is not simple. You've got to have some technology in place to help you discover what really is on your network. But then the next step is an inventory of authorized and unauthorized software that's on those devices. Same sort of thing. What software is on there? What's authorized? How do we get rid of the installation or the execution of the unauthorized software? And if you take that step, you can see your life's going to get a little bit better, because you're not going to have all this crazy out-of-date software that might have lots of vulnerabilities, or something that somebody downloaded off the internet and is completely insecure. So step number 2 builds on step number 1, going back to the prioritization. And then number 3 is secure configurations for hardware and software, and I abbreviated this. It's really for hardware and software on things like workstations, servers, laptops. Think of computing devices. And the reason they focus this one on computing devices is control number 11 over there on the far right is secure configurations for network devices. And they wanted to split them out because they didn't think they had the same level of importance. But as you probably know, configurations of systems are very important if you want to lock them down, if you want to remove weaknesses that can be exploited. And the simplest one to talk about probably is passwords, password strength. And also, this one kind of gets into number 5, but accounts that maybe have never been logged into. You might have a default account or login ID and password. This machine's sitting on your network. No one's logged into it. The first person that logs into it, if they know those default credentials, which they well may know, then they can access the system. But anyway, secure configurations, you think about it now, you only have authorized hardware and software, and now these things are configured securely. They're pretty locked down. And that kind of gives you a good starting point. The 4th one is continuous vulnerability assessment and remediation, which is, as you know, there are new weaknesses or vulnerabilities being discovered all the time in operating systems, applications, middleware, databases, you name it. And those are what oftentimes the bad guys use to get into your systems. We see things in the newspaper it seems like every couple of weeks about how people have exploited vulnerabilities. So you need to be doing that vulnerability assessment and making sure that it's not just the assessment, but the remediation. It's not just enough to know that you have these vulnerabilities. It's let's get rid of the ones that we think are the most serious in our environment. And then number 5 is controlled use of administrative privileges. So those are, like it says, privileged accounts. If someone has those credentials, they can get in and do lots of damage. So you've really got to lock those down. So these are those key foundational controls that we did the research around with the Center for Internet Security and found out that only about half the organizations really have implemented these controls. So I would encourage you, if you aren't doing these things well, this is where you need to start from a prioritization point of view. In fact, I have a little note down at the bottom. There's an organization in Australia called the Australian Signals Directorate. And I think they're a little bit like our FBI in the sense that when we have a breach and we need to bring in somebody to help us investigate it. If it was a crime was involved there, our FBI can come in and help do that investigation. And it's my understanding that's what the Australian Signals Directorate does as well. So they looked at all of the breaches that they were called in to investigate, and they said if organizations would have implemented these 5 controls, it would have mitigated 85% of the breaches that they see. So these things, they're not simple, but they are very powerful. And going back to the prioritization, which I'm hitting really hard because, you know, in my experience and in the research we've done, people don't do a very good job with these things, that this is where you really want to start. So let's talk about automation a little bit, and have to differentiate between what I call administrative controls and technical controls. So any security framework you use is going to have a mix of administrative controls and technical controls. Administrative controls are things like resources are prioritized and roles and responsibilities are established. When I think of administrative controls, I think these are controls that are kind of pen and paper. They're documents that you can use. Or maybe meetings that you'll have. But the technical controls require that you really, in my thinking, you know, instrument your IT environment, instrument, if you have an operational environment, instrument that, because you're really getting data from your systems to be able to see, A, what the state of the systems is, and B, what activity is going on among the systems. So obviously if you're gonna inventory your physical devices, you're not gonna do that walking around with a piece of paper and a clipboard. You're going to have some ways to do that with automation. And baselines are created and maintained. So those are the administrative and the technical controls. And the technical controls, I say, require automation. I call it big data. You've got lots of data going on in your network. It's beyond a human's ability to collect it and analyze it by themselves. And even if they could, you've got worries about staff efficiency. And you've got to be able to do a prioritization very quickly so you can remediate whatever issues you have, starting with the most important. And then there's also stakeholder reporting. So how do we inform our various stakeholders of the state of our security? And then there's audit preparation. Obviously, the auditors are one of the stakeholders that you can be involved with. So I want to turn a little bit to how some of these technical controls can be automated. And I'm using some examples from a Tenable product. If you go to the Center for Internet Security, for example, you will find resources that can help automate some of this stuff, and many of the ones they recommend are free. So it's just real easy for me to log into our system and get some examples here, but I'm not trying to twist your arms to buy our product here. One of the things I wanted to point out in the upper left here is, you can't read it, but I can read it. It's talking about ways that you can detect what is on your network. And the Center for Internet Security, when you dive into those subcontrols, says that you need to use passive technologies and active technologies. So an active technology would be something like a scan. You've got something that's going out and looking at your network and pinging IP addresses and stuff like that to find out what's out there. A passive technology can be done a couple of different ways. One is you could have something that's monitoring the traffic on your network, and it sees a new device when it comes on the network, and it sees its IP address, and it identifies it that way. There are other things you can do too. If you were to look at logs from, say, a DHCP server or a switch, when it finds out something's new on the network, you could identify it that way. But you've got to use multiple techniques to really find out what's going on in the network. And then also, if you're concerned about mobile devices, you might need to integrate with a mobile device management system so you can find out about the systems that are potentially being managed by your organization, find out how, what version operating system they're running, things of that nature. And then the next one is what software is on your network. And there are a couple of things here that you want to look for. What operating systems are running. There are some known applications, old versions of Flash, maybe even new versions of Flash that are vulnerable. You also might have unsupported software. The example that comes to mind is Windows XP. If you've got any of those systems that aren't being patched, you want to identify that right away. And there are cases where organizations have XP systems and they can't retire them. So you're going to have to look at mitigating controls around that to make sure that if you have to continue to use it, you can do it safely. Another thing that you need to look at is what internet sites or what cloud applications are being used. Let's just say cloud applications are being used by your organization. So I set this up with a list of ones that I was interested in and just monitored for that. And we found out that Dropbox was being used. And Dropbox and some of these other applications like that can be a real risk to your organization. You can have somebody that's sending out a bunch of data that the rest is not authorized for it to be there, for one thing. It's not being managed, and then if there's weak controls, and I'm not saying Dropbox has weak controls, but you can get breached and really be bitten that way. So it's good to know what your users are doing and where they're putting that data potentially. And then I have a slide just on continuous assessment and remediation, and this nice pretty bar chart here is basically showing remediation, showing that how well you're doing in mitigating vulnerabilities. And obviously you want to know that. We have a number of customers that are showing, and I'll show you some of the examples they use in a minute, but it's not just for the security team to keep score and see what's going on. They also work with the operational teams that typically do the mitigation and sometimes can give them access into the system. So the people that are, let's say, doing the patching or putting compensating controls in place can test to make sure the patch was installed. They can also go in, if I said compensating controls, there may be a reason you can't patch. Maybe there's not a patch available, but you need to do something according to your policy to remediate that risk. So you can go in and put compensating controls in place. You need to document that you've done those controls, you've put these mitigating or compensating controls in place, and then when you run a report, if you're going to give it to the auditors, you want to be able to show them, yes, this vulnerability still shows up, but it's not a risk to us, and this is why. So that can be very important. So we generate lots of reports, and reporting is really the easy thing. You can give an auditor, a 1,000-page report, and they can dig through it, and we can do that as well as anyone. I took a screenshot here because many of our reports also have some graphics like this just at the front before you get into the real details. But for audit requirements, typically you're going to want to have something that you can give to an auditor, or in some cases I've talked to people that if they have a breach, then they'll want to essentially send or document reports on everything, kind of the state of their environment. So if they have to prove that they were doing reasonable security, that they were doing the due care and the due diligence, they can look and say, here's this report, look, we have remediated these critical vulnerabilities on this system. And then lastly is reporting to the business, which is becoming more and more important all of the time. The business owners want to know what the state of the systems are. And one of the things, kind of jumping back to frameworks again, the NIST cybersecurity framework has, in part of their identify function, you do a lot of risk assessment, and they actually encourage you to sit down with the business owners, find out what the risks are, and together decide what is the appropriate level of controls that you have to put in place. So if you have that sort of dialogue with the business owners, then you probably need to give them some feedback quarterly or periodically that says this is how we're doing. So this is something where we just run some tests. And the first one there is no new host detected actively, passively, or by event in the last 72 hours. And we've detected some new ones, so we said, well, you're not compliant there. But you can set these tests up however you want to do, and then give yourself some pass-fail sort of stuff. And I would encourage you to figure out whatever is right for your organization to report to the business. So we've talked about the foundation. We've talked about the 5 foundational cyber hygiene controls and how important they are. I want to talk for a little bit now about building on the foundation. And this slide is a complete eye chart. I can't even really read it on my computer. But on the left, I have the 5 critical controls, and then I just showed some mapping to the NIST cybersecurity framework, to NIST 800-53. And there are many places you can go on the internet to find this sort of mapping. The reason I put this slide in is I want you to know that if you start with these 5, as I'm obviously recommending in terms of your prioritized approach here, it doesn't matter where you go. This work that you have done will be foundational to any sort of compliance requirement, whether it be PCI, I didn't put PCI on here, but the same thing, or regulatory framework that you have to comply with. So it's not a dead end. It's common to everything that you would have to do. And most of these frameworks are very tailorable. If you look at the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, 853, probably not so much, but many of them are tailorable. NIST Cybersecurity Framework says, what's the risk in your organization? What are the resources in your organization? You've got to tailor what you're doing based also on your resources. So this slide just shows how you could look at your risk profile, your requirements, and your resources, look at these different frameworks you might want to comply with, and you can tailor them into your own control framework. And it can support multiple things. So don't look at these frameworks as 100% rigid. You can't go in and tailor them. In most cases, you can. So in the last few minutes, I wanted to talk about financial justification. What I want to do here is just give you some ideas of maybe things you could take back to your office and say, how can we help get the funding that we need for the security program that we need? And I didn't put the slide in here, but one of the questions that we ask in this survey that I mentioned, ask about what are some of the impediments that you have in terms of implementing or building your cybersecurity program. And we found out that they were kind of what I call organizational, things like we don't have management support, we don't have enough budget, and then there were some technical ones like we don't have the right tools, and then it was interesting, if they have the tools, it was integration among the tools is very difficult to do. And then the third one is reporting. So if you have lots of different tools out there, you've got to tie them all together and then somehow get the data out of it that makes sense. So those are some of the investments that you're going to have to make in order to have a good program. And I'm going to give you just some ideas of things you can do to justify that. So one is a number of organizations have external business partners that can have a right to audit written into their contract. And they'll say, you have to comply with the XYZ security controls, and we have the right, should we want to come in and audit you. I had a coworker in a previous company. She worked for a large national, I guess I'd call it pharmacy, chain of pharmacies. And they, for some reason, they were a pharmacy for other organizations, so they had lots of business partners, and she was on the audit side of security, and she said they would every month have at least one audit that they were doing. And so, if you can put a framework in place and get some efficiency around that, that'll really help. Then the other one that's super important is the reduction in frequency and severity of security incidents. So I don't have the slide up now with all 20 of those controls, but I think of the first 5, and there are other ones in the 20, I think of them as preventive controls. If you do these things, you're going to prevent incidents, you're going to prevent breaches. And then there are other controls of saying, even though we're doing all these great things, we know we're not preventing everything. So you have detective controls to kind of find out what's slipping through, and then you have corrective controls to recover from problems that you might have. But the idea here is if you have strong preventive controls, you're going to need to, you'll have fewer incidents, let's just put it that way, that you're going to have to investigate, and you'll save some real money there. Improve maturity and effectiveness of security operations. If you think back to the standardization that's really implied with an inventory of authorized and unauthorized hardware and software, your IT department is going to have a much simpler life. Your standardized people aren't installing their own software, and you'll see some cost savings there. And then more effectively present the security state to the corporate leadership and the board. We already talked about that. Increased buy-in from leadership about your security program, and that is really key. I read an article, it's probably 2 years ago now, it was by Carnegie Mellon, and they did some research about how do you justify security expenditures to the board, and it was qualitative research. It was based on interviews. They talked to CISOs basically, but the common thread there is we use a security framework and we say, here's the template of what we should be doing, and as I mentioned earlier, this is where we're weak and we need to implement or strengthen these controls. So I wanted to, we've talked about some of the cost savings already here. This chart is not readable for you, but I want to point it out. This is from the city of Portland, so maybe folks like you, and the CISO there is a pretty clever person. Christopher Padron is his name, and he developed this spreadsheet where he listed, you can't really read it in the middle, but the fourth column over is basically their service catalog. So as a security organization, they provide security services to the departments in the city of Portland. So they listed all those services that they provide, and they then mapped them against the CIS Top 20, and they also mapped them against the cybersecurity framework, and then they gave themselves kind of scores. In fact, if I jump ahead to the next slide, it's still pretty hard for you to read, but he showed where they had challenges identified. Maybe I'll do it this way. Challenges identified were kind of listed here, and then they said budgets, are we funded for this, are we underfunded? And up there, I can't even really read it from here, but he had kind of multiple years where he mapped out a program of how he was going to do this. And this, he actually spoke about this at a webinar. Are any of you familiar with the MSISAC, the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center? The CIS kind of runs that. Well, Christopher did a webcast on that. You could go search for it on their site if you would like to, where he walks through this in a little bit more detail, and he also made this available in an Excel format.
The speaker before lunch went through this whole thing.
Oh, did he? That was Brian Ventura?
Yeah, so we'll all have access to it on the website.
Okay. Okay, cool. I was going to say, he's given us access or the right to put it up on our website, and so it's there as well. But this is a really useful tool for you to do some of that, that justification. And yeah, when I put this together, I didn't know Brian Ventura was going to be here. He was talking about the SAN stuff, most likely. And he's a security architect for the city of Portland who was, with Christopher, put this together. But there are some tools out there that are very useful. So, kind of to summarize, what I was talking about in terms of the prioritization, again, is prioritize your assets based on your risk, and then do the basic things first. Put those foundational controls in place, and then build on it. So it's really a pretty simple recipe. Not at all simple to do, but it is a simple recipe. And with that, I am finished and have probably a couple of minutes if you have questions or comments. Yes?
One of the things we regularly read about is that email is the #1 cause of events, security events. And yet you were describing these 5 controls prevent 85% of the issue. How do you correlate those two statements?
So the question was, how do you correlate the fact that email is a lot of ways that malware gets into your organization, and I talked about these 5 things and didn't really even talk about the email. You know, the one I didn't talk very much about was number 5, the controlled use of administrative privileges. And if you drill into that, for example, and look at the subcontrols, it talks about system administrators should, if you're a system administrator, you're a privileged account, you should not even be able to have email or web browser access from that machine. So there's some separations you can do, particularly on those privileged accounts. And then the other thing is to look at, if you're doing browsing, which is right up there with email, oftentimes you're using web browsers on that. So that could kind of get into the vulnerabilities, how you've configured your web browsers. If you're an organization that's pretty concerned about security, you might block some things in the web browser, configure them so they cannot do some certain things. But now that's an excellent point. So we have 1 more minute if there's another question. All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.